A good part of Western media has been telling us for years that Vladimir Putin is trying to recreate the Soviet Union and its militant, expansionist foreign policy. But what exactly was Soviet foreign policy about in the first place? Here to help with this historical question is Dr. Michael Jabara Carley, a prominent Canadian historian and professor of history at the University of Montreal, specializing in 20th century international relations, primarily in the relations between the Soviet Union and Western powers from 1917 to 1945. Professor Carley, welcome.
Thank you for inviting me, Pascal.
Thank you very much for saying yes, because I'm very impressed with your work. You wrote these big volumes, 3 big volumes about Soviet foreign policy. So who better to ask than you about what were Soviet foreign policy goals? And you looked at the early period, right? So 1917, the revolution. How would you describe this process of the Soviets coming into power? And then also suddenly being tasked with taking care of external relations?
Well, at the beginning of the development of Soviet foreign policy in the 1920s, there was a clash inside the Soviet government about what the major objectives of the Soviet Union should be. Should it be a world socialist revolution? Or should it be like any other power, protecting the borders and the national interests of their country? And the German ambassador in Moscow at the time observed that there was a conflict inside the Soviet government between what he called Comrade Kominternovsky, that is to say, the people in the Comintern being the organization set up in 1919 to spread revolution, and Comrade Narkomindyelsky, the Narkomindyel being the Commissariat for Foreign Affairs. And these two comrades clashed during the 1920s. Comrade Narkomindyelsky accused Comrade Kominternovsky of sucking ideas from his thumb. And Kominternovsky accused Narkomindyelsky of being a total opportunist.
Mm-hmm.
And this clash went on for almost the entire period of the 1920s and ended at the end of the 1920s when Stalin sort of settled it, and the Comintern became less important, and the national interests of the Soviet state became paramount. And the many Western historians to this very day say that the Soviet Union didn't have a foreign policy. Its policy was world Soviet revolution, but that's not true.
How did it go though, like this formation? I only read a couple of papers, and the one that comes to my mind is, and I forgot who wrote it, but it's about the continuation of the politics of first the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union toward Mongolia. Mongolia is this interesting case because Mongolia as we know it today, Outer Mongolia, became independent in 1911, and that had a lot to do with its relationship with the Tsarist Empire, because they kind of split it off from China. And this paper, and I forgot the guy's name, it shows how, the idea of especially the Lenin wing of the Soviets was to help these countries to gain their independence, but this very quickly then changed into, integrating Mongolia into the orbit of the Soviet Union, although Mongolia, of course, never became a Soviet a republic, right? It always remained independent. But so the whole argument there was that the Soviet Union actually continued more or less the foreign policy of Tsarist Russia. Is that something that your research can affirm, or what do you how do you characterize it?
My feeling is that there is continuity between Tsarist Russia, the Soviet Union, and the Russian Federation. And so you can learn a lot from about the way Soviet diplomats reacted to particular sorts of problems. For example, by reading my books, my trilogy, or my trilogy plus one, on the period between 1917, 1941, 42. There is continuity. And, I like to repeat the statement that the Tsar Alexander III once was recorded as saying. He said, Russia didn't have any friends, but its army and its navy.
Mm.
And what he really meant is that Russia had to depend on itself to defend its national interests and its borders, whether it was in the Far East, in the maritime provinces, or whether it was on the frontiers with Europe, or in the south, or in the north with the Baltics. The first two, the two most important people in the Narkomintel, the Commissariat for Foreign Affairs, in the 1920s were Maxim Litvinov and Georgy Chicherin. And Chicherin was focused on the Soviet Union's southern frontiers, and Litvinov was focused on on Soviet frontiers with Poland and the Baltics and Finland. But they were interested in this. Their primary interest was the security of Soviet Russia and then the Soviet Union after December 1922. Security, security, security. That's the number one primary interest of all three of those states. And it's not necessarily an aggressive policy. It's a defensive policy. Peaceful coexistence, for example, was a policy developed in the 1920s, and it was a reflection of the weakness of the Soviet state at that point. And the Soviet state, Soviet Union, always felt it was not as strong as its potential adversaries in the West. So it was always willing to improve relations with the West, always, except that the West interpreted Soviet policy as always being aggressive, but it was not.
This is probably one of the largest misunderstandings, right? Because even today, when people say like, "Oh, the today's Russia is like the Soviet Union is trying to expand," the Soviet Union didn't try to expand, did it? It tried to stabilize it and have an outcome with the especially with Europe, but that never worked out.
Well, if you look at the map, the frontiers of the Soviet Union, of Russia, and the Russian Federation now, even in spite of the territorial losses after the disappearance of the Soviet Union, they're huge.
Mm-hmm.
They're huge. It's a huge job protecting those frontiers, and and naturally, the people who are tasked with that job sometimes feel on the defensive, and so instead of being aggressive, they're willing to work with other powers in order to have stability on their frontiers. That's the policy. It's so obvious when you read the archives. It jumps out. That's one of the things that's, if I can promote my own books, published, by the way, by the University of Toronto Press. Mustn't forget that. It jumps out. It's obvious.
The argument that the other side brings, is usually, look what they did to Poland and to Romania, to Bulgaria, right? Subduing these states, installing regimes. But I mean, in your interpretation, this all happens for the sake of having buffers toward the actual Soviet borders, right?
That's in 1945. But when you mention Poland, Poland's an interesting case because the relationship between Poland and Soviet Russia and the Soviet Union in the interwar years was not good. And the Poles always said, well, we have to fear Russia, whether it's red or white.
Mm.
But there was a war between Poland and the Soviet Union, Soviet Russia in 1919, 1920. And it wasn't Soviet Russia that was the aggressor. It was Poland that was seeking to reestablish its frontiers of 1772. And during the interwar years, Poland's a good example. That's why I mention it. Poland saw itself between two great powers, potential hostile great powers, Germany on one side and Russia, whether it was red or pink or white, on the other side. And Poland said, well, we got to keep balance between the two. But they didn't do that. They were more partial to the Germans than they were to the Soviet side. And proof of that is that the Soviet government, Soviet diplomats, sought on many occasions during the interwar years to improve relations with Poland. It's absolutely clear from the archives, and the Poles always, more or less, always refused those overtures.
Then why is it that Stalin in the end agreed with Hitler in this secret addition to the secret additional protocol to split up Poland and kind of divide it among the two? Why not say like, no, we absolutely need this, Hitler, leave Poland where it is?
That's a complicated question. But let me go back to what my point before, and that the Soviet Union was always seeking to improve relations with the West, with everybody. And between 1933 and 1939, the Soviet government was the first government, in my opinion, to recognize the danger of Nazi Germany to peace and security in Europe. And it sought with all the great powers, Romania, Poland, United States, France, Britain, etc., to improve relations, to alert them to the rising danger of Nazi Germany. Nobody listened to them. No one.
I mean,
Litvinov.
They didn't even have diplomatic relations with everybody in Europe, right? Because a good number of European states first did not recognize the Soviet Union as the successor government of Tsarist Russia.
Well, that's right. But during the 1920s, well, there was a gradual process of the Western states recognizing the Soviet Union, for example, France and Britain and Italy in 1924, in the United States in 1933, and the various other states in Europe, for example, recognizing the Soviet government at various points in the interwar years.
Yeah.
I can't remember when the year that the Japanese recognized the Soviet government. It must have been in maybe, I don't want to say but early 1920s. So it's a gradual process. The point is to go back to the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, which is the pact that anticipated the changes in borders in Eastern Europe. The Non-Aggression Pact was not the Soviet Union's first choice. It was the last choice after 6 years of attempting to improve relations with the with the West. And it was the French and the British, primarily in Western Europe, that repeatedly refused Soviet overtures to improve relations. Stalin looked at this in August of 1939 and he said, holy moly. Well, he didn't say holy moly, but he said, Bоже мой, Bоже мой, we gotta be, we can't trust the French and the British to make a war-fighting alliance with us against Nazi Germany, and we could end up with the French and the British sitting on their hands in Western Europe while we fight alone against Nazi Germany. We're not going to do that. We're going to, however smelly the agreement is, we're going to make an agreement with Hitler, not because we want to be allies with him and Nazi Germany, but because we want to stay out of harm's way and remain neutral. And as for Poland, right up until the last day before the war broke out in the 1st of September 1939, hated the Soviet Union, refused all overtures of the proffered Soviet hand. And the Poles claimed that, they were stabbed in the back. They were victims of duplicity of the Soviet side. But that's not true. They refused Soviet offers. They hated the Soviet Union. They acted as spoilers during the 1930s, spoilers of collective security and mutual assistance offered by the Soviet Union to the West. It's a fact. It's an irrefutable fact. So if you were Stalin, what would you have done?
It's geography. And I cannot, one of the things that's difficult probably to wrap your head around is that when we look back today at this time, we have all of these books, we have the books of view and so on, and it looks like one coherent development, right? But that's not what it was like when you were there. And one of my prime examples is that the Japanese, the Japanese were not precisely weak and they were not precisely dumb. I mean, they were highly integrated into the entire system, and they completely, utterly, totally misunderstood what was happening at the time. Two of their governments collapsed because they couldn't understand what was brewing in Europe. First, when Hitler created the non-aggression pact with the Soviets, that shocked them to the core. Government collapsed because their entire idea was like, but we thought everybody against the Soviets, right? And then they turned around, and actually 1.5 years later, they said like, okay, fine. If the game is with the Soviet Union against the others, then it's going to be Tokyo, Moscow, Berlin, Rome. They did a neutrality pact, and 6 weeks later, Barbarossa and war against the Soviet Union. And the Japanese, they were furious, and another government collapsed because it was so obvious that, I mean, their whole foreign policy, their whole approach just gone out of the window twice. It was extremely difficult to understand actually what was being in the works.
Well, the Soviet Union and Japan had very bad relations at the end of the 1930s, and there was a major military clash in 1939 on the borders between Manchuria and Mongolia.
Gol.
and it was called the Battle of Khalkhin Gol. And at that battle, the Red Army beat the hell out of the Japanese, beat the hell out of them. And I think that sort of woke up the Japanese that it wouldn't be so easy to try to take Soviet territories in the maritime provinces, and probably had some. I'm not an expert on Japanese foreign policy, but I know there were two schools of thoughts in with respect to Japan and its objectives. One being to look to the south, one being look to the north, and they ultimately decided to look to the south. And one of the reasons they did that was because they had second thoughts after the beating they took in 1939. They had second thoughts about taking on the Red Army.
They did. The one thing not to underestimate with Japan is just how distributed power actually was, and how the military could create facts on the ground and string Tokyo along. I mean, it was much less integrated and directly controlled than people would like to think. But that's a bit beside the point, because I think for the Soviet Union it was different, right? The Soviet Union actually had a pretty good grasp over its military, especially after Stalinist purges, which were brutal in the mid-30s.
That's right, yeah. I don't buy that argument that some apologists for Stalin legitimize his actions against the high command of the Red Army, saying that they were really getting ready to plot against his governance. I don't buy that at all. I think the purges, no matter how many historians from wherever they are working, they look at the purges, everybody has an opinion about why they occurred. Okay. But I don't know if we'll ever have an explanation that actually sticks about why that occurred. They one of Stalin's biographers, his name is Stephen Kotkin, said that Stalin turned against his most loyal associates, people that would have walked through fire to save him, and he turned on them. Why would he do that? What was in his mind? And the answers are, who knows? I mean, there are lots of opinions by why this happened. But there'll always be opinions in my view.
So you don't think that the Red Army was problematic to Stalin in 35 or so? So it is a mystery to you why he purged, because can you remind me how many thousands of people were purged?
Well, that's always a matter of debate, but according to the Soviet archives, it was around 700,000 people.
Who, some of them shot, right, and some of them just put away in Siberia.
Most of them were shot, but others were sent to labor camps, and the conditions there were not conducive to long life, so many people died. But according to the archives and according to a book that was published some years ago by Yale University Press by I think his name is Leno. He did a big, thick book on based on Soviet archives. It starts with the murder of Kirov, who was a close associate of Stalin, and he tries to answer the question of how many people. actually were victims of the purges. And he comes up with around 700,000. But other people say it was more, you know, who knows? But it was a lot of people.
This then, I mean, one interpretation of Stalin is that he was a popular interpretation is that he was very aggressive. Another interpretation is that he was highly risk averse, actually, and he tried time and again to take the path of least risk in foreign policy. Would you subscribe to that?
Risk adverse, absolutely, with one big exception, the Winter War against Finland.
Right.
When I don't know how informed your listeners are about Soviet history, but the Winter War was a war with Finland that broke out at the end of November 1939 and continued until the middle of March 1940. And it's a long story, the negotiations and everything that occurred between Finland and the Soviet Union in the autumn of 1939. The idea was that there would be a trade of territory between Finland and the Soviet Union to move the frontier on the Karelian Isthmus away from Leningrad because it was only 30 kilometers away.
Right. And this was the negotiation position before the war started, right? The Soviets said, give us more land, you get something else in return, and we are good.
That's right. And, I like to look at Stalin in the summer, and I'm repeating myself here from other interviews. Forgive me for that, but I think it's important to say I see Stalin in the autumn of 1939 as someone who I compare him to the gambler who goes to the casino. I'm a little sarcastic about it. I call it the Red Star Casino. And he plays roulette. And he wins time after time after time. His number keeps coming up. He never loses. So he draws the conclusion that he can't lose. And that's the idea he took into the negotiations with Finland. Molotov, who was Vyacheslav Molotov, who was the foreign commissar at that point, and Stalin's right arm in many things, said that the Red Army would be in Helsinki in 2 or 3 days. The high command of the Red Army said 2 or 3 weeks. And they thought, oh, the Finns will, will shoot a cannon shell across the border, and the Finns will say, oh, okay, we'll do a deal. But instead, they shot back. And the war was
brutal.
Was brutal. That's what it was. In the end, the Soviet side won out. But the Germans who were watching the war thought, the Red Army didn't fight very well, and we can beat them if we want. That wasn't exactly true, but the high command learned from its mistakes, and in the end, they forced the Finns to come to the table, because it was either you deal with us now and get reasonable terms, or you deal with us later and you get nothing. In fact, if you want, you can make comparisons between what happened in the Finnish War and what's going on now in the Ukraine.
I think it's a very straightforward thing to do. And for a matter of fact, the current Finnish president, Mr. Stubb, actually did that when he went to Washington. He literally said, we we have experience in negotiating a peace deal with the Soviets, with the Russians. And what he was referring to was, of course, the Winter War, which then unfortunately also was a moment when Finland then actually, this revanchism, and they went back into the continuation war. And Finland only got settled after 45, when basically actually in 53, when they agreed to sign a piece of paper saying that, no, 48, a piece of paper saying like, okay, fine, we will help you protect your border. In return, you don't occupy us. And that was the basis of Finnish Cold War neutrality.
Well, that was a very good example of the flexibility and subtlety of Soviet foreign policy, is that the Red Army could have crushed Finland in 1944, but they didn't do that. One of the reasons they didn't do it was they didn't want to piss off their allies, their British and American allies, where there's a lot of sympathy from Finland.
Right.
So the Soviet side offered terms. The president or whatever he is of Finland, he needs to go back to his history. In fact, maybe I should send him a copy of Volume 3 of my trilogy, and he'll get the story right. But I don't know why Finland made a terrible mistake, and in my opinion, and this is off the topic, but why would Finland want to ruin this policy of neutrality with Soviet Union and then the Russian Federation that worked for what, 75 years? Why did they do that?
But this is the thing. It's what frustrates me as somebody, not just the channel is called Neutrality Studies, but also what I do academically. It's like there is all of these track record of neutral buffer zone active zones working, and there's very good arguments also by a brilliant Austrian historian in Germany, Michael Gahler, that even the Soviet offer in 52, the Stalin notes 53, of a neutral unified Germany was meant absolutely seriously. He wrote a book, also 1,700 pages, on how serious that offer actually was. And until today, there's another group of historians who are saying, no, he never meant it. This was a ploy. They just wanted to undermine the West.
Not true. Not true. That's what I say about Soviet policy and the continuity between Soviet policy, Tsarist policy, Russian policy. There is continuity. All you have to do is take the time to look at it carefully and go and read the Soviet archives. Don't just read Western archives where the authors of the papers all hate the Soviet Union or hate Russia. Read what the Russians say themselves. That's why I say these archives in Moscow are so important. You have to go and read them if you want to understand how the Russian mentality and their Russian perspectives. You have to do that. If you don't, you're on the road to ruin.
The argument by also an Austrian historian, Peter Ruggenthaler, about why the Soviets were not serious is because he goes to the archives and says we have no papers that would prove that the Soviets actually prepared for a neutral Germany.
I don't think that's true. I think a major issue for the Soviet side with respect to Germany during those years was to keep it neutral and keep it from becoming an ally of the United States.
Right.
There's great subtlety in Soviet policy, and this idea of peaceful coexistence, which we associate with the period after 1945, is present from 1918 onward.
So what is it then that time and again kind of sabotage this? Do you think Stalin thought he could avert war with Germany by doing the pact in 39?
I think he thought he could delay it, and that was his objective. And he felt that that the Soviet Union would not be ready for war with Germany until 1942, 1943. And he was desperate to stay out of the war until that time. But, smart military leaders always think they're not ready for war. It's always better to avoid war than to plunge into it.
Right. And how does it interlink with, then the foreign policy goals of the time? You said security, security, security. But over and beyond that, do you find other traits of what the Soviets wanted? Like, for instance, like recognition. They were not in the League of Nations, right? The League wouldn't have them.
Well, the League of Nations, the idea for the Soviet Union to enter the League of Nations in 1935, or was it 1934? 1934 was this was a French idea. This was a French idea to help the French side to justify improved relations with the Soviet Union, to get them into the League of Nations. Maxim Litvinov, who was the Narcom Commissar for Foreign Affairs in the 1930s, saw the League of Nations as a potential tool to against the expansionism of Nazi Germany. It was supposed to be a tool of collective security and mutual assistance against Nazi Germany. It's there in the papers. Litvinov states very clearly why the Soviet Union went in. And when he was talking to Stalin about these matters, as he often did when they were determining what Soviet policy would be, that was the main argument.
Right. So how to use the international structure in order to gain what you want, and you say like it was external security.
That's right.
I mean, the one pact that actually did work very well for the Soviet Union was the Neutrality Pact with Japan. It held for 4 years, 41.
That's right. That's right. It did work.
And it was in the end. I mean, the Japanese were very, very bitter that the Soviets actually threw it away 1 year before its supposed ending. And until the very end, the Japanese believed that the neutral Soviets would help them to do a separate peace with the US. And it was, of all the peace feelers, this was the most, the one that they believed in most. How do you assess this one?
I think that Stalin was looking ahead to the post-war period. He wanted to protect and continue cooperative relations, especially with the United States, but also with Britain. And Roosevelt, as early as 1943, had approached Stalin about coming into the war against Japan. In fact, Roosevelt first raised that idea with the Soviet side when Litvinov had just arrived in Washington in 1941 as Soviet ambassador. And
that was which month?
It was in December of 1941.
So after the attack, after Pearl Harbor.
Just after it, he wanted the Soviet Union to come into the war against Japan. And the Soviet Union said, "No way, we've got our hands filled with the Germans. We couldn't possibly come in now." And Roosevelt said, "Yes, if I were in your shoes, I would say the same thing." Mm-hmm. But he came back to it in 1943 to get Stalin to agree to it, and ultimately he did agree to it. 3 months after the end of the war with Nazi Germany in Europe. And so it wasn't duplicity so much towards the Japanese as it was Stalin's hope to give something to Roosevelt that would encourage a continuation of good relations between the two countries after the end of the war.
Interesting. So as a way to smoothen up this transition period, okay, agree to backstab this one, which has lost already anyhow. What do you think then? 45, 46. What sabotaged, a division that some people had, even in 44, because like I must just repeat, like in 44, Bretton Woods, the Soviet Union was at the table in Bretton Woods, and there was an idea of creating a common global structure, and that, of course, didn't become a reality, but it didn't dawn on people until about 47, 48 that there would be a kind of, the Cold War split. That 45, 46, that was very much a moment when we could have had a common security structure, but we didn't. What happened there?
Well, I would argue that that's not so. I would argue that the most shocking event of 1945 was Churchill's orders to his high command to prepare a contingency plan for war against the Soviet Union in July of 1945. That contingency plan was called Operation Unthinkable. And it was a document that was kept top secret until 1998, when it was finally declassified and people could read it at the at the National Archives in Kew, just outside of London.
So Churchill prepared for war. He told them prepare for war, although he then immediately lost power, right? Like just after that.
Well, he was defeated in the elections
Yeah.
in July of that year. The point is that that the Soviet Union played the major role in the war in destroying the Nazi Wehrmacht. Okay, the estimates are at the end of the war, 80% of casualties on the German side were inflicted by the Red Army. The Soviet Union was a valuable ally, was the most important ally in the war against the Axis powers. And here is Churchill ordering his high command in April of 1945. The war wasn't even over. And he's thinking about contingency plans for a war against the Soviet Union to push them back towards the east and to push them out of Poland. A war. It would have been. When I think about this issue of Operation Unthinkable, I think it's a scandal. It's scandalous, and that the weeders of the archives in the Foreign Office should have got rid of that document, because it's a stain upon the honor of the British government at the time.
Why? Why that? I mean, does it come from a different place than just visceral hate?
It's this other issue about when the Cold War began. Most people say it began after 1945, but I say that it began after 1917. And my argument is very simple. I say, look at the major characteristics of Cold War after 1945, and you'll see them already in 1918 with respect to Soviet Russia. What are they? Cordon sanitaire, the Red Scare, peaceful coexistence. Look at the iconography of the inner warriors and compare it with the iconography after 1945. Exactly the same. The Bolshevik, the classic image of the Bolshevik after the end of the World War I is this disgusting, dirty-looking, vile individual with a knife clenched between dirty teeth, between broken, foul-looking teeth. You can almost smell the foul odor of perspiration of this Bolshevik whose knife is clenched between his teeth and blood is flowing from the corners of his mouth and dripping from his dagger, and it's the blood of the innocents of the bourgeois West.
Mm.
That's the image of 1918, 1919.
You're absolutely right. And actually, these people were not so much afraid of the Russians. They were afraid of the ideology. That's why they started shooting their own lefties, like in Germany, right? Rosa Luxemburg and so on. They were afraid, and this scare goes into the 20s, into the 30s. The Swiss were afraid of this ideology spreading.
They were. Look at the Spanish Civil War, 1936. The British, in the British archives, you'll see these ridiculous documents where they're looking at the danger of Bolshevism being spreading from Spain into France, and that the French were in their Kerensky period before the seizure of power by the communists. Kerensky, of course, was this right-wing socialist in Russia in 1917, who for a few months controlled the so-called provisional government, and he was a right-wing socialist opposed to the Bolsheviks, and in the British saw France as being on the threshold of a communist revolution. 1936, they were afraid of communism and the spread of communism.
Question, like, because a lot of things depend on the way we frame them, right? So we are used to frame the First World War and then interwar period and then the Second World War. But if I'm listening to you, then it would actually make more sense to frame it as the Great War and then the beginning of the long Cold War, and then hot phases within the long Cold War. And one of the things is that the Second World War was not one war; it was a multitude of various wars, right? Do you think it makes more sense to think of it as hot phase of the long Cold War?
Well, if you take my view of it, there were periods not only of Cold War but of hot war as well.
Mm-hmm.
For example, the foreign intervention in 1917, 1921 by the West to try to overthrow the Soviet government. That was a hot war.
Yep.
But the Grand Alliance of 1941 to 45 was an interregnum in my long Cold War.
Mm.
And it was based on the very simple principle that dates back to, I don't know, classical Greece or Rome. The enemy of my enemy is my ally.
Right.
And that principle was applied. The Soviet side, or some of its diplomats, would say, that the big question of the 1930s was, who is enemy number one? Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union? And all the elites in Europe came up with the wrong answer.
But so where does this leave us, right? With regard how the 20th century developed. Maybe also the question of, like, again, framing the Russian side still until today frames the Second World War as the Great Patriotic War. So
That's right.
Do the Russians also, like, not think of it as just a continuation of the first one, which our version alludes to, but how do they see it?
The Great Patriotic War?
Yeah, why is it the Great Patriotic War and not the Second World War? Like, how does modern Russia understand this history?
This war was so terrible, so traumatic. Nobody knows how many people were killed, civilians, soldiers, but the present estimate is around 27 million people. If you talk to, any sort of Russian people that you should bump into if you happen to be in Moscow or visiting, and you get to talking about that period. They'll say, "Oh yeah, my grandpa or my great grandpa, he was a Red Army soldier," or yeah, my family in the Ukraine was wiped out by the Germans, or almost everybody will say that, yeah, I had relatives who were killed during the war or who fought in the war.
And I second that. I haven't talked to a Russian colleague yet who doesn't know of relatives who died in that war. I haven't met one. They all have stories. Yeah.
It was a traumatic experience, and an extraordinary experience, because in the first 5 months of the war, the Red Army lost the equivalent of 177 divisions, around 3 million soldiers lost. 3 million. The Red Army was pushed back to the outskirts of Moscow before they defeated the Wehrmacht in the Great Battle of Moscow and pushed them away from the frontier, from the capital. And that was the first time in the war, the first time that anybody on what became the Allied side inflicted a strategic defeat upon the Wehrmacht. It was a remarkable victory. And of course, Stalingrad and Kursk and Operation Bagration, they were remarkable victories against the Wehrmacht. And from June of 1941 until the summer of 1943, the Red Army fought alone on the European continent against the Wehrmacht. Fought alone.
So
so just to finish, for Russians, this was like beating the Mongols, in the 14th century. What was his name? I'll forget. I can't remember the Moscow prince who, shame on me, I can't remember his name, who defeated the Mongols in the 14th century. That's the kind of victory it was. And it's remembered to this day. Hell, you can go to a concert in Moscow now, and they sing this war hymn called Svashenaya Vaina, Sacred War. Everybody stands up, and you look at the people in the audience, and you can see the tears coming down their face. Just credible.
Yeah.
Credible experience. That's what it is.
This is the kind of thing, all of the things that the current political establishment in Europe and America just brushes away. It's like, they're just pretending. I mean, because we know how the war was, because Normandy. And it's like, you have no clue.
They don't get it. They don't get it, and it's very dangerous.
So
very dangerous.
Very, very dangerous. Maybe just to bring it back, one of the things that I also repeat time and again is that there were so many offers, right, for creating a common security structure. Not just Gorbachev, the CSCE, the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, was a Soviet idea sold via Finland to the rest, and then 5-year process, and it led to great outcome. We had the reunification of Germany under a neutral framework idea of 53, and even before that, you're saying in the 20s and 30s, we had these ideas of Stalin of how to create some form of stability on the continent. Do you think the Europeans have it in themselves to actually at some point take them seriously, or is Europe kind of dooming itself to constantly screw it up?
No, they'll constantly screw it up. Absolutely. It's hopeless. Well, I'm not going to say it's hopeless. Maybe it's not hopeless. But, if you listen to the foolish things that are said by the French or the British or the Germans, I think to myself, these guys are playing with fire. They're playing with fire. They don't know what they're doing.
But they are just a continuation of Churchill, right? It's this same thing.
Well, Churchill's a complicated guy. He in the 1930s he was an important advocate of better relations with the Soviet Union. He was a flip-flopper. He believed in the principle of the enemy of my enemy is my ally. And to the question of who was enemy number one, he got the answer right, Nazi Germany. But, as soon as the danger passed at the Battle of Stalingrad, the victory of the Red Army at Stalingrad, he began to relax. And when he relaxed, he let his old demons take over again, his anti-communist demons. That's Churchill.
Thank you very much for this. This is highly fascinating. The way to frame the long Cold War history since 1917. Last question. Do you think that period has ended, or are we now still in the post-1917 world?
Well, I think I wouldn't frame it that way. I think the issue is the West's problem of getting along with Russia. And they just there's a book by a Swiss author who claims that Russophobia is 1,000 years old. I can't think of his name. Book that was published in French. The West's problem is it doesn't know how to get along with Russia, and it's anti-communism, Russophobia, the unwillingness of Russia to sort of roll over and accept Western domination of the world.
I mean, the insane thing is, not even if you marry the highest echelons of the elite into Russia, it works. I mean, the Tsar Nikolai was a cousin of Wilhelm and was a cousin of what's his face, George. They were all grandchildren of Victoria, and even that didn't keep them from going at each other's throats.
That's right.
Okay,
it's a problem.
It's a problem. Maybe we need to add some psychologists to this discussion in order to dig deeper. Michael, people who want to find your books, they should, of course, look for them online. But is there a place where a homepage or something where all of this work of yours is gathered, where people can find your collections?
Well, I have I have how should I say websites at academia.edu and ResearchGate, and on the website of the University of Montreal. But the books are available at almost all good bookstores and Amazon, and sometimes the University of Toronto Press has good sales going on. They can look there too.
I will
The
put the
books,
link. I will put the links to your books into the description box of this video below. Everybody,
Good.
please check out Michael's fantastic historic work. Michael Carley, thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks for inviting me to talk with you.